The atmosphere inside the zenith spire was thick enough to choke a vacuum dweller. It was a space designed to diminish the individual, a cathedral of governance whose crystalline ceiling stretched so high that the internal weather systems occasionally produced a fine, shimmering mist near the apex. Below, the mosaic floor was a sprawling masterpiece of 1,000 different stones, each one hauled from the core worlds of the myriad orbs. To walk across it was to tread upon the history of 47 civilizations, a silent reminder that order was purchased with the weight of ages. Exarch Vorksul of the Thal'Khar Hegemony did not walk. He marched. His forearms were folded behind his back, his obsidian-scaled skin glinting under the artificial starlight of the chamber. He moved with the practiced cadence of a conqueror who had already seen the maps redrawn in his mind. When he reached the central dais, the murmur of 1,000 delegates died a sudden, strangled death. It was not the silence of respect. It was the silence of a herd watching a predator decide which throat to tear first. The hegemony addresses the sovereignty on a matter of vital preservation, Vorksul began. His voice, amplified by the translation lattice, was like the grinding of tectonic plates. It was cold, devoid of the melodic flourishes typical of his species. The Ethelgard Passage, currently under the stewardship of the Terran administration, has become a bottleneck of inefficiency. Trade metrics are down by 12%. Security protocols against the Rim Raiders are laughably porous. For the stability of the myriad orbs, the hegemony formally invokes the mandate of higher stewardship. He paused, his 3 eyes scanning the human delegation box. Humanity has 30 standard days to vacate all military and administrative assets from the Ethelgard Passage, he continued, his tone shifting into something more predatory. All civilian outposts will be absorbed under hegemony law. We have positioned 8 battle groups, totaling 4,600 warships, at the edge of the neutral zone. They are not there for scenery. Should the transfer be delayed by so much as a single hour, we will consider it an act of systemic insurrection. The chamber erupted, not in cheers, but in a chaotic wave of translated protests and frantic signaling. The Vesper delegates, frail beings of light and song, began a mournful resonance that vibrated through the floorboards. The council chairman, an ancient creature whose species had seen the birth of the spire, struck his staff 3 times. The sound echoed like a funeral bell, slowly pulling the room back to a state of manageable panic. Director Eris Thorne stood up. She did not look like a woman facing the extinction of her people's greatest achievement. She wore a simple charcoal suit, the only ornament being a small silver pin of a rising sun on her lapel. Her hair, once a deep raven black, was now shot through with streaks of iron gray at the temples. She walked to the podium at a pace that could only be described as maddeningly deliberate. She didn't look at her notes. She didn't look at the screaming headlines on the digital tickers. She looked directly at Vorksul. The Terran administration acknowledges the hegemony's concerns, Eris said. Her voice was as calm as a frozen lake. We formally request the full 30-day window as guaranteed under Article 19 of the Sovereign Charter. We will use this time to conduct a thorough internal review of our assets and prepare a formal response through the appropriate channels. We ask that your battle groups remain outside the demarcation line during this period, as mandated by the same law. That was it. No shouting. No pleading for mercy. No desperate appeals to the Council for intervention. She simply turned and walked back to her seat, her expression as unreadable as a blank slate. Vorksul narrowed his eyes. He had expected fire. He had expected a frantic scramble for concessions. This cold, procedural compliance felt wrong. It felt like a trap, yet his intelligence reports were absolute. The humans had exactly 612 registered combat vessels, most of them aging frigates that would be turned to scrap in the first volley. 30 days, Vorksul hissed into his private comms as he stepped down. Let them spend their last month praying. By the time we're done, they won't have enough left to bury. Outside the chamber, the hallways were a hive of whispers. A senior Vesper diplomat caught Eris as she was heading toward the Maglev transports. Director Thorne, the Vesper's translator, hummed with a worried pitch. My government is deeply concerned. The Hegemony has 4,000 ships. 4,000. We are discussing a potential sanctuary program for your refugees, but the logistics are— Thank you for your concern, Ambassador, Eris interrupted, her smile thin and distant. But I believe you're getting ahead of yourself. We're just following the rules. But rules don't stop railguns, the Vesper cried out. No, Eris whispered, stepping into the transport as the doors began to hiss shut. But they do buy you time. And time, Ambassador, is the only currency that matters when you're about to change the world. As the transport sped away from the Zenith Spire, Eris closed her eyes. She didn't see the shimmering lights of the station. She saw a sky of fire. She felt the phantom heat of a sun that had been turned into a weapon. 612 ships, she thought. That was the number the Hegemony knew. That was the number they had spent 60 years making sure the Hegemony believed. In the back of her mind, a different number echoed. 15,000. 15,000 ships built in the dark. 15,000 ships fueled by 60 years of silence. She opened her comlink and typed a single phrase into a highly encrypted channel. The wolf is at the door. Wake the pack. 60 years is a long time for a wound to stay fresh. For most species in the myriad orbs, the Oros incident was a footnote in a history book, a tragic but small-scale colonial dispute that had been resolved with a few formal apologies and a commemorative plaque. For humanity, it was the day the universe told them they were alone. Silas Vane remembered the smell of ozone and burning plastic. He had been a 24-year-old lieutenant back then, stationed on the SSV Defiant, a ship that had no business being in a combat zone. Oros had been a paradise world, a lush green jewel in a sector that was supposed to be protected by the sovereign peacekeepers. Then the Marauders came. They weren't an empire. They were a plague. A fleet of rusted, jagged ships that cared for nothing but salvage and slaughter. We've sent the distress signal, Captain. Silas had shouted over the roar of a failing life support system. The peacekeepers are only 2 sectors away. They'll be here in 20 minutes. The captain hadn't answered. He was staring at the tactical display as the 3rd colony transport was vaporized in high orbit. 20 minutes was an eternity when the enemy was firing at point-blank range. The peacekeepers didn't come in 20 minutes. They didn't come in 2 hours. They spent 4 hours debating the jurisdiction of the sector. They spent another 3 hours calculating the risk to their own capital ships. By the time the shimmering gold hulls of the sovereign fleet arrived, the green jewel of Oros was a blackened cinder. 60,000 people were gone. Not soldiers, families, teachers, children. Silas had stood on the deck of the broken Defiant, watching the sovereign admiral offer a graceful, pre-recorded speech about the tragedy of bureaucratic delay. He had seen the way the other species looked at the human survivors, with a pity that felt more like a dismissal. "You're young," they seemed to say. "You don't understand how the gears of the galaxy turn." That was the day the gears of man began to turn in a different direction. 3 months after the funeral, a meeting was held in a bunker beneath the Arctic ice on Earth. There were no cameras, no press releases, only 12 people, the architects of a new human future. "We will never ask for help again," the then Director of Defense had said. Her voice was a rasp of cold fury. "If the galaxy won't protect us, we will build something that makes their protection look like a child's toy." "But we're being watched," one of the politicians had argued. "The sovereignty monitors our industrial output. They track our metal refined, our fuel consumed. If we start building a massive fleet, they'll crush us before the first keel is laid." "Then we don't build a massive fleet," a young Silas Vane had spoken up from the back of the room. "Not where they can see it. We give them the 600 ships they expect. We keep them polished, we keep them loud, and we keep them mediocre. We make ourselves look like the junior partners they want us to be." "And the real fleet?" the director asked. Silas stepped forward to the holographic projector. "We build it in the places they've marked as useless. The moons with no atmosphere. The asteroid belts with high radiation that fries their standard probes. We don't use their tech. We don't use their designs. We go back to the drawing board. We overbuild everything. More armor, more power, more redundant systems. We build ships that aren't elegant. We build ships that are bone-breakingly tough." Project Eventide was born that night. Now, 60 years later, Grand Marshal Silas Vane stood on the command deck of the SSV Iron Weaver. He was an old man now, his face a map of scars and deep-set lines, but his eyes were as sharp as the day Oros burned. The Iron Weaver was not a ship of the myriad orbs. It didn't have the flowing curves of the Vesper vessels or the ornate gold filigree of the Peacekeepers. It was a slab of aggressive geometry, 4 kilometers of reinforced tungsten and composite plating. Its engines were oversized, capable of generating enough thrust to move a small moon. Its main battery was a kinetic transposition cannon that could bypass standard energy shields by phasing the projectile through the target's protective layers. It was a monster, and it was beautiful. "Report," Silas growled, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the deck plates. "All systems green, Marshal," a young officer replied. Her eyes were wide as she looked at the tactical map. "Project Eventide is at 100% readiness. The Obsidian 4 shipyard has been cleared. The other 12 facilities are reporting similar status." "How many, Lieutenant?" The officer swallowed hard. 14,984 combat-ready vessels, sir, including 31 Titan-class dreadnoughts." Silas looked out the viewport. They were in the heart of a nebula, the thick ionized gas hiding the massive fleet from any long-range sensors. Thousands of lights blinked in the haze, the silent, glowing eyes of a species that had been waiting for a long time to stop being afraid. "The Thal'Khar think they're coming for a scrap," Silas muttered, a grim smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "They think we're bone-dry on options. They're about to find out what happens when you push a quiet neighbor too far." "Sir," the officer said, her voice dropping, Do you think we can actually win? 4,000 Thal'Khar ships is a lot of fire." "Winning isn't the point," Silas said, turning away from the window. "The point is making sure they never forget the price of trying. We're not fighting for a corridor, Lieutenant. We're fighting for the 60,000 souls who died because no one showed up. We're the ones who show up now." He walked over to the main console and tapped a command. The ghost plating hummed into life, a low-frequency vibration that settled into the bones of everyone on board. To the outside world, the Iron Weaver didn't exist. It was just another pocket of cold gas in a lonely sector of space. But inside, the air was electric. 30 days, Silas thought. 30 days for the hegemony to feel smug. 30 days for the myriad orbs to pity us. He leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on the armrests of a throne built from 60 years of stubbornness. "Let them come," he whispered to the ghosts of Oros. "We're ready to bring the thunder." The countdown on the main screen began its slow, methodical pulse. 29 days, 23 hours, 59 minutes. Humanity had been patient for 60 years. They could handle one more month. In the dark, the engines of 15,000 ships began a low, rhythmic thrum, a heartbeat of iron and fire that echoed the collective vow of 1 billion people. Never again. It was more than a slogan. It was a physical reality, forged in the heat of a secret sun. And soon, the galaxy would have to learn how to pronounce it. "Marshal," the comms officer called out. "Director Thorne is on the secure line. She says the Hegemony representative was particularly charming today." Silas chuckled, a sound like gravel in a blender. "Tell the director to keep playing the part. Tell her to look as scared as she needs to. The bigger their egos, the harder they'll pop when we stick the needle in." "Copy that, Marshal. Orders for the fleet? Keep 'em ghosted. No transmissions, no stray pings. We don't exist until I say we do. And tell the boys in the engine rooms to stay sharp. When we hit the Ethelgard passage, I want us coming in hot enough to melt their sensors." The officer nodded, her face hardening into the same expression Silas had seen on every face in Project Eventide. A look of grim, absolute purpose. They weren't just soldiers. They were the shield that had been forged in the fire of a tragedy. And they were finally going to be used. The Iron Weaver slid deeper into the nebula, a ghost ship leading a ghost fleet, waiting for the 30-day clock to strike midnight. Across the galaxy, in the luxury suites of the Thal'Khar Hegemony, champagne was being poured. In the halls of the myriad orbs, funeral arrangements were being discussed. And in the dark, humanity simply waited. They had learned that silence was the most powerful weapon in the universe, and they were about to use it to deafen the stars. The internal atmosphere of the Obsidian Forehanger was a sharp contrast to the sterile, majestic silence of the Zenith Spire. Here, the air tasted of scorched cobalt and recycled oxygen, a heavy metallic soup that sat at the back of the throat like a physical weight. There were no crystalline ceilings or shimmering mists. Instead, there were miles of exposed structural ribbing, stained with the soot of 1,000 welding torches, and the constant, rhythmic thrum of heavy machinery that vibrated through the very marrow of one's bones. This was the belly of the beast, the hidden heart of Project Eventide, and it had not known a moment of true silence in over 40 years. Grand Marshal Silas Vane stood on a gantry, suspended 300 meters above the primary dry dock. From this height, the workers below looked like tiny, industrious insects swarming over the hull of a leviathan. The ship occupying the dock was the SSV Persistence, the sister ship to the Iron Weaver, and one of 31 Titan-class dreadnoughts that humanity had forged in the dark. It was a brutal, uncompromising slab of dark composite, 4.5 kilometers long, designed not to look like a ship, but to survive an apocalypse. Its surface was jagged, covered in the ghost plating that would make it invisible to anything but the most advanced, close-range optical sensors. "Marshal!" a voice crackled over his earpiece, cutting through the low-frequency growl of the hangar. "We've got a situation in the primary reactor core of the Persistence. Level 4 containment breach during the final power-up." Silas didn't flinch. He adjusted the collar of his weathered flight jacket and tapped his comms. "Give me the sitrep, Chief. Is it going to blow?" The voice on the other end belonged to Chief Engineer Elias Miller, a man who had spent 35 years living in the sunless depths of Obsidian 4. "Not yet, but the core is redlining. We've got a team trapped in the secondary cooling ring, If we don't vent the heat sink in the next 5 minutes, we lose the core and the ship. If we do vent it, we bake the team inside." Silas looked down at the massive hull. He knew the cost of every bolt on that ship. He knew that if the Persistence was destroyed, the entire line at the Ethelgard Passage would have a hole large enough for a Thal'Khar battle group to sail through. But he also knew the names of the people on that cooling team. He knew their faces. He had sat at their tables and drank their synthetic coffee in the mess hall. "Can we override the manual lock?" Silas asked, his voice low and raspy. "Negative," Miller replied, and the sound of his breath was heavy with the weight of the choice. "The bypass is scorched. Someone has to go into the crawl space and pull the rod manually. It's a one-way trip, Marshal. The radiation in there is enough to turn a man into a ghost before he even finishes the turn." Silas closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. He thought about the 60,000 who had died on Oros. He thought about the silent pact that every person in this hangar had signed with their lives. They weren't here for medals. They weren't here for history books. They were here so that the next generation wouldn't have to live in the shadow of a master. "I'm on my way down," Silas said. "No, you're not," a new voice broke into the channel. It was a young voice, sharp and steady. This was Specialist Kalen Reed, a 22-year-old technician who had been born on this moon and had never seen the sky of Earth. "Marshal, I'm already at the hatch. I've got the manual override tool." "Kalen, get out of there," Silas ordered, but there was no iron in his voice, only a heavy, aching realization. "That's an order, son." "With all due respect, sir, stow it," Kalen replied, and the use of such blunt street slang in the presence of a Grand Marshal would usually have been grounds for a week in the brig. But today, it was the only truth left. Someone has to make sure the Iron Weaver has a sister to watch its back. My dad died on Oros, waiting for a fleet that never showed up. I'm not letting this ship go dark because I was too yellow to turn a wrench. Silas stood frozen on the gantry. Around him, the thousands of workers had stopped. They were all listening to the open channel. This was the essence of humanity that the Thal'Khar could never quantify. It wasn't about the number of ships or the caliber of the railguns. It was the fact that a 22-year-old kid was willing to walk into a nuclear furnace to ensure a future he would never see. "Chief Miller," Silas whispered. "Prepare the vent. Kalen, you have 3 minutes before the heat sink triggers automatically." "I only need 2, Marshal," Kalen said. "Tell my mom the garden on level 6 looks great this year." The channel went quiet, save for the heavy, rhythmic thud of the reactor's heartbeat. Silas watched the telemetry on his handheld device. He watched the radiation spikes climb into the lethal range. He watched the temperature in the cooling ring begin to stabilize. 1 minute passed, then 2. The manual override clicked. The Persistence groaned as the pressure was released, a massive plume of superheated steam venting into the secondary containment baffles. The ship was safe. The core was stable. The 15,000 ship dream was still alive. "Kalen?" Silas asked. There was no answer, only the soft, haunting hiss of static. "He didn't make it," Chief Miller said, his voice breaking. He got the rod turned, but the seal blew right in his face. "He's KIA, Marshal." Silas Vane didn't move. He stood on the gantry, looking down at the dark, silent hull of the ship that Kalen Reed had just died to save. A tear traced a path through the grease and soot on his cheek, but his expression remained as hard as the tungsten plating below him. "Write it down," Silas said to his aide, who was standing trembling behind him. "Add his name to the wall of the unseen. And make sure his mother gets the full pension. Tell her Tell her he was the bravest soldier I ever knew." The aide nodded, struggling to find words. "But Marshal, how do we explain this? We can't have a funeral. We can't even send the body home. The secrecy. The secrecy is the only thing keeping his sacrifice from being in vain," Silas snapped, his grief turning into a cold, sharp blade. "We don't get the luxury of mourning. Not yet. We carry him with us. Every man, woman, and deck jockey in this facility carries him into that passage. We're building a guarantee, remember? That kid was the down payment." Silas turned and began walking back toward the command center. His boots echoed on the metal grating. A lonely, hollow sound. He thought about Eris Thorne, sitting in that high, beautiful spire, lying to the faces of 47 civilizations. He wondered if her burden was heavier than his. She had to live with the lies, while he had to live with the dead. But as he reached the command deck and looked at the sprawling tactical map of the galaxy, his resolve hardened. The Thal'Khar were coming. They were coming with their 4,000 ships and their centuries of arrogance, expecting to find a broken, fearful species. Instead, they would find a wall of iron built from the bones of specialists like Kalen Reed. "Marshal, we have a message from the director," a comms officer said, handing him a tablet. "The Thal'Khar have officially begun their mobilization. Exarch Vorshul is moving his flagship toward the neutral zone." Silas took the tablet and swiped through the data. He saw the massive energy signatures of the Hegemony fleet. They were bright, loud, and confident. They were broadcasting their strength to the entire galaxy, a peacock's tail of military might. "The fools," Silas muttered. "They're making so much noise they can't hear the ground shaking beneath them." He looked back at the Persistence. The ship was being towed toward the primary launch tube, its dark hull blending into the shadows of the hangar. It was a ghost, a phantom, a memory of a tragedy turned into a weapon of salvation. "Is the fleet ready?" Silas asked the room. 14,983 ships ready for FTL jump, sir," the officer replied. "We're just waiting for your mark." Silas nodded. He thought about the 60,000 on Oros. He thought about Kalen Reed. He thought about the billions of people on Earth who had no idea that their lives were being bought with the silence of a few. "We wait for the 30th day," Silas said. "Let the Exarch have his parade. Let the galaxy watch us crawl. Because when we finally stand up, the stars themselves are going to blink." He sat down in his command chair and stared at the dark screen. The countdown was still ticking. 28 days, 14 hours, 12 minutes. Every second felt like a year, every minute like an age. But Silas Vane was an old man, and he had learned long ago that the most dangerous thing in the universe wasn't a ship or a gun. It was a human being with a debt to pay, and nothing left to lose. "Get those birds in the pipe, double time," he barked at the deck chief. "I want every hull checked, every shield buffed, and every railgun calibrated to 10% over safety specs. We aren't just going to a fight, we're going to a reckoning." The hangar exploded back into motion. The torches flared, the hammers swung, and the massive engines of the human fleet groaned in the dark. A low-frequency growl that sounded like the beginning of the end of the world. Silas Vane sat in the center of the storm, a man who had seen the cinders of the past and was now prepared to set the future on fire to protect what was left. The private chambers of Exarch Vorshul were a testament to the fact that the Thal'Khar Hegemony had forgotten what it was like to be afraid. The walls were made of living coral from the depths of Thal Prime, pulsing with a soft, bioluminescent violet light that synchronized with the heartbeat of the occupant. Rare silken tapestries woven from the dreams of the Vesper poets, hung from the vaulted ceilings, and the air was scented with the musk of 1,000 different spices from 12 conquered worlds. It was a room designed for a god, or at least for a man who believed he was one. Vorjul stood by the crystalline viewport, watching the rhythmic dance of his honor guard. 300 heavy cruisers were performing a series of complex maneuvers in the void beyond the zenith spire, their engines leaving trails of golden fire against the velvet black of space. It was a display of precision and power that had intimidated every species in the myriad orbs for 3 centuries. He turned as the heavy doors of his chamber slid open, admitting a younger Thal'Khar officer. This was Commander Zalth, a rising star in the Imperial Intelligence Division, known for his meticulous data analysis and his somewhat unsettling habit of questioning settled conclusions. "Exarch," Zalth said, bowing low, his forearms tucked against his torso in a gesture of profound submission. "I have the updated surveillance reports from the Ethelgard Passage." "And?" Vorjul asked, his voice a bored, resonant thrum. "Have the humans begun their retreat? Have they started packing their primitive crates and weeping for their lost dirt?" Zalth hesitated, a flicker of movement in his secondary eyes that Vorjul didn't miss. "Not exactly, Exarch. Our long-range probes are detecting very little movement within the corridor itself. The human civilian stations are operating as usual. Their registered military vessels, those 600 aging frigates, are holding position at the primary relay stations." Vorjul let out a sound that was the Thal'Khar equivalent of a chuckle, a dry, rattling noise. "They are paralyzed by fear, then. They hope that by standing still, the storm will somehow pass them by. They are like the burrow beasts of my home world, freezing in the light of the predator until the teeth are at their throats." "Perhaps, Exarch," Zalth said carefully, "but there is an anomaly." Vorjul sighed, turning back to the window. "I am weary of your anomalies, Zalth. You've been chasing sensor ghosts for 2 weeks. What is it this time? A reflection from a gas giant? A glitch in the translation lattice?" 6 days ago, one of our deep space reconnaissance drones near the Obsidian Belt went offline, Zalth explained, stepping forward to project a holographic map. Before it went dark, it captured a brief energy spike. It was massive, Exarch. Briefly, it registered as a fusion signature larger than anything in our naval registry. When we sent a second drone to investigate, there was nothing there, only empty space and high-intensity radiation. The Obsidian Belt is a graveyard of dead stars and jagged rock. Vorjul dismissed with a wave of his hand. It is full of radiation. It is a wasteland that even the humans haven't bothered to survey in 50 years. Your drone likely struck a stray asteroid or suffered a localized reactor failure. The second drone found no debris, Zalth persisted, his voice tight. And the energy signature? It didn't look like a reactor failure. It looked like an engine ignition. A very large engine. "Zalth," Vorjul said, turning to face the younger officer, his 3 eyes glowing with a cold, predatory light. "Do you understand why we are the hegemony? It is not just because we have the most ships. It is because we understand the fundamental hierarchy of the galaxy. Humanity is a minor species. They have been members of this spire for 80 years. They have no deep space shipyards. They have no high-grade industrial base beyond their home system. They spend their time arguing about trade tariffs and building schools. They do not have the capacity, the resources, or the will to build anything that could threaten a single one of our battle groups." "But the director, Eris Thorne," Zalth whispered. She was so calm. Too calm. "She is a diplomat," Vorjul spat. "She has spent her life learning how to lie with a straight face. She is bluffing because she has no other cards to play. She is hoping that by acting like she isn't afraid, we will hesitate. But she has forgotten who she is dealing with. I do not hesitate. I have burned worlds older than her entire civilization. I am not suggesting they have a fleet that can match ours, Zolth said, his arms twitching in a defensive posture. But what if they are hiding something? A single prototype? A suicide weapon? Then our shields will absorb it, and we will turn their world into a memory, Vorjul said, stepping closer until he was towering over the younger man. You are letting your imagination interfere with your duty, Commander. Go back to your station. Review the deployment for the Ethelgard Passage. I want the Third Armada in perfect formation when the 30th day arrives. I want the entire galaxy to watch as we brush the humans aside like dust from a sleeve. Zolth bowed again, deeper this time, but the doubt in his eyes remained. As you command, Exarch. Once the doors had closed, Vorjul returned to his viewport. He looked at the golden fire of his fleet and felt a surge of familiar, cold satisfaction. He did not believe in anomalies. He did not believe in secret fleets. He believed in the weight of metal and the inevitability of power. He thought briefly of Aris Thorn. He remembered her silver pin, the rising sun, a quaint, primitive symbol for a species that was about to see its sun set forever. He wondered if she truly believed the words she had spoken in the spire, or if, in the quiet moments of the night, she saw the same 4,000 ships that he did, looming over her people like a death sentence. He poured himself a glass of fermented nectar, the liquid shimmering like liquid emeralds. To the end of the small things, he toasted to the empty room. 30 days. It was a generous window. He could have demanded the transfer in 10, but there was a certain pleasure in the wait. The anticipation of the strike was often as rewarding as the strike itself. He wanted the humans to stew in their own helplessness. He wanted the fear to marinate until it was thick enough to taste. In the hallways of the Zenith Spire, the other delegates were already maneuvering for the fallout. The Harkin Collective was offering to buy up human mining rights at a fraction of their value, assuming the humans would be desperate for hard currency to fund their relocation. The Vesper were writing poems about the tragedy of the short-lived. Everyone had already written humanity's obituary. Vorjul liked that. It meant the transition would be orderly. There would be no messy protests from the other member species because they had all already accepted the outcome. The humans were the only ones who hadn't realized they were dead yet. He sat on his throne of living coral and closed his eyes, drifting into a light predator's sleep. He dreamed of the Ethelgard Passage, the massive swirling clouds of gas, and the glittering lanes of trade. It was a beautiful prize, and it would look much better under the golden banners of the hegemony. He did not dream of the dark. He did not dream of the obsidian belt, or the jagged silent moons where thousands of humans were currently holding their breath. He did not dream of the Iron Weaver or the Persistence. He was an exarch of the Thal'Khar. He was the master of 4,000 ships. He was the inheritor of 1,000 years of victory. And as the 30-day clock ticked down in the heart of the spire, Vorjul slept the peaceful, untroubled sleep of a man who was absolutely, undeniably, and catastrophically wrong. Meanwhile, in a small, cramped apartment in the lower levels of the spire, Aris Thorn sat alone at a small wooden table. It was a piece of furniture she had brought with her from Earth, made of real oak, a rarity in this world of metal and glass. She was eating a simple meal of rice and vegetables, her movements slow and weary. The headlines on her wall screen were screaming about the impending transfer. The commentators were debating whether she should be impeached for her lack of aggression or praised for her realism. She ignored them. She looked at the small silver pin sitting on the table next to her plate. "Is it worth it?" she whispered to the empty room. "All the lies? All the people we're asking to hold their breath in the dark?" She thought about the reports from Silas Vane. She thought about the death of specialist Kalen Reed. She didn't know the boy's face, but she knew his story. It was the same story she had been telling herself for 60 years. "We are not building a weapon," she told herself, her voice shaking slightly. "We are building a future where no one has to be a specialist who dies in a reactor core. We are building a future where my daughter can look at the stars and see light, not a threat." She picked up the pin and fastened it back to her lapel. Her hands were steady now. The grief was there, but it was anchored by something much stronger. Solidarity. It was a human word, a concept that the Thal'Khar translated as collective inefficiency. They didn't understand that a human being would give everything they had to a person they had never met, simply because they shared a dream. Aris stood up and walked to the window. She could see the Thal'Khar cruisers in the distance, their golden trails mocking her. "Enjoy your parade, Vorshul," she thought. "Enjoy the luxury of your arrogance, because in 26 days, the silence is going to end. And I hope you're ready for what comes next." She turned off the lights and sat in the dark, watching the stars. They looked so small from here, so fragile. But she knew better. She knew that in the dark, even the smallest star could be the center of a world. And she knew that humanity was done being small. In the silence of the apartment, the only sound was the steady, rhythmic ticking of an old mechanical clock. A piece of earth, keeping Earth time, in a place that had forgotten what it meant to be home. Tick, tick, tick. The countdown continued, and the galaxy slept on, unaware that the shadow it had ignored for 60 years was about to become the dawn. Across the spire, in a dozen different apartments, other humans were doing the same thing. They were eating quiet meals. They were looking at the stars. They were keeping the secret. They were the silent partners in the most ambitious gamble in the history of the galaxy. They didn't look like warriors. They didn't look like conquerors. They looked like librarians, teachers, and shopkeepers. They were the lesser beings of the Thal'Khar reports. But as the night wore on, they each, in their own way, reaffirmed the silent pact. They would stay quiet. They would stay patient. They would wait for the 30-day clock to strike 0, and then they would show the galaxy what a lesser being could do when its back was against the wall and its heart was full of fire. The Thal'Khar Hegemony had 4,000 ships. Humanity had a reason. And in the cold calculus of the universe, Silas Vane knew which one was going to win. Marshal, the comms officer's voice, came back through the Ironweaver's speakers, startling Silas out of his thoughts. "We've detected a Thal'Khar scout ship moving along the edge of the Obsidian Belt. It's on a standard patrol path, but it's sniffing closer than usual." Silas leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Do they have a lock?" "Negative. They're running passive scans only. If we stay dark, they'll pass right by." Silas gripped the armrests of his chair. "Stay dark," he ordered. "Do not fire, unless they cross the 3,000-kilometer line. I don't care if they see our shadows. Until they see our steel, we're just space dust." The room went quiet again. They watched the tiny golden dot of the Thal'Khar scout move across the sensor screen. It was small, fast, and arrogant. It moved with the confidence of a ship that knew it was the master of the void. It passed within 5,000 kilometers of the Iron Weaver. For 30 seconds, the two ships were practically touching in the vast scale of space. The human crew held their breath. Silas Vane felt his heart pounding against his ribs, a heavy, rhythmic drum. The scout ship continued on its path. It didn't slow down. It didn't turn. It simply faded into the distance, its mission accomplished, its reports showing nothing but empty radiation. "Another ghost," the officer whispered, letting out a long breath. Silas Vane didn't relax. He kept his eyes on the screen until the scout was long gone. "Not a ghost," Silas corrected. "A witness who didn't know what he was looking at. And that, Lieutenant, is the only reason we're still alive." He looked back at the Persistence, now fully loaded and ready for launch. The ship looked like a jagged tooth in the darkness, waiting to bite. 60 years, Silas thought. 60 years of being space dust. He looked at the countdown. 28 days, 13 hours, 58 minutes. The wait was almost over, and the reckoning was just beginning. The Velonis Fringe was a region of space that defined the word desolate. It was a graveyard of celestial ambition, where ancient supernovas had left behind nothing but jagged clouds of silicate dust and high-intensity radiation that could strip the shielding off a standard civilian hull in a matter of hours. It was exactly the kind of place where humanity had spent 60 years hiding its heart. Inside the command deck of the Iron Weaver, the air was cold enough to frost the breath. Grand Marshal Silas Vane stood before the primary tactical holomap, his hands clenched behind his back so tightly that his knuckles were white. On the screen, a small, flickering blue icon represented the Morning Star, a civilian transport ship carrying 212 colonists bound for the outer mining settlements. They had taken a wrong turn. A navigational computer glitch, likely caused by the unpredictable ion storms of the Fringe, had dumped them out of faster-than-light travel 3 sectors away from their intended destination. Unfortunately, that destination was currently occupied by a Thal'Khar Hegemony patrol led by the warship Gilded Talon. "Marshal, we have a visual," a sensor technician whispered. Her voice was trembling. "The Gilded Talon has intercepted the Morning Star. They've disabled the transport's main thrusters with a low-yield ion pulse. They're playing with them." On the main viewport, a grainy, long-range feed from a cloaked relay drone flickered into life. The Gilded Talon was a masterpiece of Thal'Khar arrogance, a golden, needle-like vessel of 2,000 meters, its hull shimmering with the light of 100 decorative spotlights. Beside it, the Morning Star looked like a rusted tin can. The Thal'Khar ship moved with agonizing slowness, circling the crippled transport. Every few minutes, it would fire a low-power laser, not enough to breach the hull, but enough to boil the outer coolant lines and send the civilian ship spinning into a slow, nauseating tumble. "They're trying to bait a response," Silas muttered, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "They know there's a human administrative station 40 light-years from here. They want our registered frigates to come screaming in so they can claim we violated the neutral zone. Marshal, the Morning Star is broadcasting on all open frequencies," the comms officer said. "They're pleading for mercy. They're telling the quads they have children on board. 64 minors, sir." Silas didn't answer. He looked at the icon of the SSV Revenant, a stealth-equipped human frigate that was currently sitting just 400,000 kilometers away from the engagement. The Revenant was part of Project Eventide. It was equipped with experimental phase cannons that could cut the Gilded Talon in half before the Thal'Khar even realized they weren't alone. But if the Revenant fired, the secret was over. The Thal'Khar would see the signature of a weapon that didn't exist in the registered human arsenal. They would see the ghost plating in action. The 30-day window would slam shut, and the Hegemony would launch a preemptive strike with their full 4,000 ships before humanity could finish waking up its 15,000. 200 lives against billions, Silas thought. The math was simple. The math was absolute. And the math made him want to vomit. "Marshal, the Revenant is requesting permission to engage," the officer said, her voice rising in desperation. "Captain Vance says he has a clean solution. One shot, sir. He can scrap that skinny boat and bug out before their distress beacon even clears the nebula." Silas looked at the screen. He saw the gilded talon extend its boarding clamps. The Thal'Khar weren't going to destroy the ship. They were going to board it. They were going to take those 200 people as security detainees. If they take them, they'll scan their personal belongings, Silas whispered to himself. They'll find something. A piece of tech, a souvenir from a shipyard worker, a data pad with a stray coordinate. The command deck was silent. Every eye was on Silas. This was the test. This was the moment where the silent pact demanded its blood tax. "Hold your horses, Revenant," Silas said into the comms. His voice was dead, devoid of any inflection. "You are ordered to maintain ghost status. Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage." "Marshal, they're boarding," the tech screamed. "We can hear the screaming on the open channel. They're blowing the airlocks." "Cut the audio," Silas barked. "Sir?" I said, "Cut the audio." The room went silent. The visual remained. A silent, horrific pantomime of a golden predator devouring a silver prey. Silas watched as the Thal'Khar boarding parties, 4 armed shadows in shimmering vacuum suits, swarmed into the morning star. He didn't look away. He forced himself to watch every second of it. He watched as the lights on the morning star flickered and died. He watched as the golden ship began to tow the human transport back toward hegemony space. "The Revenant. They're reporting the quads are moving out," the comms officer said, her voice now a flat, hollow shell. "They're taking them to the penal colony on Velonis Prime." Silas turned away from the screen. He felt 100 years old. He felt like the soot of Oros was back in his lungs, choking him. He walked over to his command chair and sat down. His hands were shaking, so he hid them in his lap. "We just sold them, didn't we?" the young sensor tech asked. She wasn't looking at her console. She was looking at Silas with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. "We have 15,000 ships sitting in the dark, and we let them take 200 of our own, because we were too scared to use one of them." "It's not about fear, Lieutenant," Silas said, but even to his own ears, the words sounded like a lie. "It's about the guarantee. If we fire now, we lose everything. Every school on Earth, every colony in the inner belt, every child who hasn't been born yet. We trade those 200 for the survival of the species." "Is that what we are now?" the girl asked, a single tear tracking through the grime on her face. "A species that does math on its own children? My grandfather told me Oros was a tragedy because the peacekeepers chose politics over people. What did we just choose, Marshal?" Silas didn't have an answer. He looked at the countdown on the wall. 22 days, 6 hours, 40 minutes. The turning point had arrived, not with a roar of cannons, but with the silent theft of a transport ship. The humanistic theme, the idea that humanity was protecting its future, had been tested against the brutal reality of the present, and the result was a bitter, metallic taste in the mouth of every soldier on the Iron Weaver. "Get back to your stations," Silas said, his voice regaining its rasping iron. "We don't have the luxury of a conscience. Not for another 22 days. When this is over, you can hate me all you want. You can put me on trial. But until then, you will hold the line. You will stay ghosted. And you will remember that every second of silence we buy is paid for in the blood of the morning star. He stood up and walked toward his private quarters. He needed to be alone before he broke. In the dark of his room, he pulled out an old, crumpled photograph. It was of a woman and a young boy, standing in a green field under a blue sky that no longer existed. "I'm sorry," Silas whispered to the ghosts. "I'm so sorry." But as he sat there, he realized something that chilled him more than the cold of space. The secret was no longer just a burden of labor and resources. It was a monster that was starting to eat its own. And he wondered, for the first time in 60 years, if the fleet they were building would be enough to save the soul of the people it was meant to protect. The Zenith Spire had never felt more like a cage. For Aris Thorne, every step across the mosaic floor felt like a walk toward a gallows. The news of the Morning Star's detention had reached the human delegation 3 hours ago. Officially, the Hegemony was claiming the ship had been smuggling proscribed materials into a restricted zone. Unofficially, everyone knew it was a message. Aris was summoned to the private viewing gallery of the High Chamber, a place usually reserved for the most senior leaders of the myriad orbs. When she entered, she found Exarch Vorjul waiting for her. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood Commander Zolth, the intelligence officer whose eyes seemed to drill holes through her diplomatic mask. "Director Thorne," Vorjul began, his voice purring with a satisfaction that made Aris's skin crawl. "It seems your people are as clumsy with their cargo as they are with their trade routes." The Morning Star was a civilian transport, Aris said, her voice a perfectly tuned instrument of weary indignation. "It was carrying families and mining equipment. Your seizure of that vessel is a violation of the Sovereign Charter's right to free passage." "The Charter protects legitimate trade," Zolth interrupted, stepping forward. "It does not protect the transport of military-grade industrial components." Aris felt a cold spike of alarm in her chest, but she didn't let a muscle twitch. "Our mining colonies require industrial components, Commander." "That is hardly a revelation." Zolth reached into a small stasis box on the table and pulled out an object. It was small, no larger than a human child's palm. It was a toy, a model of a starship, crudely carved from a piece of dark, heavy metal. "This was found in the possession of a 10-year-old boy on the Morning Star," Zolth said. "His father is a senior technician at the Velonis Administrative Station." "It's a toy," Aris said, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "My people carve them for their children. It's a tradition." Zolth didn't smile, but his eyes brightened. "The tradition is fascinating, Director. What's more fascinating is the material. This isn't standard hull plate. Our labs ran a deep scan on this toy. It is composed of a high-density tungsten osmium weave, reinforced with carbon nanotubes. It is a material that, according to our records, humanity does not have the facility to manufacture." He set the toy on the table. It made a heavy, ominous thud. "Furthermore," Zolth continued, "the atomic signature of this metal matches the energy spike our drones detected near the Obsidian Belt. The one your administration claimed was a sensor glitch." Aris looked at the toy. She knew exactly what it was. It wasn't just a model. It was a piece of scrap metal from the primary keel layer of the SSV Persistence. Some father, proud of his work, had likely pocketed a shard of the ghost plating and carved it into a ship for his son, never imagining that a child's plaything would become the thread that unraveled the greatest secret in human history. "It is high-grade mining scrap," Aris said, her voice like ice. "We use it for ballast. The boy's father likely found it in a bin of material that can absorb 90% of a Thal'Khar sensor sweep?" Vorjul asked, leaning forward, his shadow engulfing the table. A bin of material that humanity has no record of refining? He stepped closer, his forearms splayed in a gesture of overwhelming dominance. You are hiding something, Director. I thought you were merely stubborn. I see now that you are deceptive. You are smuggling technology. You are attempting to build something in the dark. Perhaps a small fleet of stealth runners? A desperate attempt to harass our supply lines? Eris looked into the Exarch's eyes. She saw the arrogance there, the bone-deep belief that humanity was too small to be truly dangerous. He thought they were smugglers. He thought they were building a few stealth runners. Even with the evidence in his hand, his pride wouldn't allow him to see the truth. He couldn't imagine a world where the lesser species had outthought him by a factor of 10,000. The hegemony does not care for mysteries, Vorjul hissed. We have decided that the 30-day window is a luxury you no longer deserve. Given the evidence of proscribed technology, the High Command has authorized an acceleration of the mandate. Eris felt the world tilt. What? You have 24 hours, Vorjul said. By this time tomorrow, the Ethelgard Passage must be cleared of all human presence. If not, the Third Armada will not wait for the 30th day. We will begin the cleansing of the corridor immediately, and for every hour you delay, we will execute 10 detainees from the Morning Star. Starting with the technicians. The room went cold. The humanistic theme, the responsibility to the future, was now screaming in Eris's ears. If she agreed, she surrendered the passage, and the secret would eventually be found out anyway, leading to the destruction of humanity. If she refused, 200 people would die in the next day, and the war would begin before the fleet was ready. Silas Vane had said they needed 28 days to fully sink the kinetic transposition drives of the 15,000 ships. If they fought now, they would be fighting with a fleet that was only 70% operational. They would win, but the casualties would be in the millions. The cost of the secret had just tripled. I need to consult with my government, Eris said. Her voice was a ghost of itself. You have 24 hours, Director, Vorjul repeated, turning his back on her. I suggest you spend them wisely, and leave the toy. It is evidence of your treachery. Eris stumbled out of the viewing gallery. Her legs felt like they were made of water. She made it to a private comms booth and punched in the emergency code for the Iron Weaver. Silas's face appeared on the screen moments later. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. Eris, what is it? They have a piece of the plating, Silas, she whispered. A toy. A father gave it to his son on the Morning Star. They know we're hiding tech. Silas closed his eyes, a long, weary sigh escaping him. God damn it. They've cut the window, Silas. We have 24 hours. If we don't clear the passage, they start killing the colonists. 10 an hour. Silas was silent for a long time. The only sound was the hum of the ship's life support. We aren't ready, Eris, he finally said. The drives on the second and third waves haven't been calibrated. If we jump them now, we lose 3,000 ships to hull shearing before they even reach the fight. Then what do we do? Eris asked, a tear finally breaking through her composure. Silas, they're going to kill those people. They're going to kill the children. We hold, Silas said. His voice was like a hammer hitting an anvil. Silas, no. We hold, Eris, he shouted, and for the first time she saw the raw, bleeding pain behind the Marshal's eyes. If we move now, we lose the war. We lose everything. We have to let them. We have to let it happen. You're talking about murder, Silas. I'm talking about the survival of 4 billion people, Silas roared back. Do you think I want this? Do you think I haven't seen enough fire for one lifetime? We have to stay dark for another 6 days. That was the math. The math is broken, Silas, Eris cried. The moment they kill those people, we aren't the ones who protect the future. We're just the ones who survived it by being monsters. Silas leaned into the camera, his face filling the screen. Listen to me, Eris. You go back in there. You tell them that the human government is in chaos. Tell them the communications are down. Buy us every hour you can. Lie, cheat, steal. Do whatever you have to do. But do not surrender the passage. What about the detainees? Silas's expression went flat. The same look he had when the Morning Star was boarded. They're already gone, Eris, he whispered. We lost them the moment they took that wrong turn. We just haven't said the prayers yet. He cut the connection. Eris sank to the floor of the comms booth. She looked at her hands. They were the hands of a diplomat. They were clean. But in the reflection of the screen, she saw a woman who was covered in the soot of Oros and the blood of the Morning Star. She thought about the boy and his toy ship. A father's love, a simple gesture of home, had become the catalyst for a slaughter. Was this the lesson? Was this what it meant to be powerful? To build 15,000 ships and yet be unable to save a single child because the greater good demanded his silence? She stood up, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She wouldn't go back to her apartment. She wouldn't eat. She would go back to the floor of the spire. She would use every word, every trick, every ounce of her soul to stall for those 60 minutes, over and over again. In the Velonis fringe, Captain Krell of the Gilded Talon looked at the first 10 names on his list. He smiled, a shimmering, four-armed gesture of anticipation. In the dark of Obsidian 4, the crews of the 15,000 ships worked with a feverish, desperate energy. They had heard the news. They knew the cost. And for the first time, the silent pact wasn't a noble vow. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that threatened to break them before the first shot was even fired. The turning point had passed. The galaxy was no longer waiting for a transfer. It was waiting for a spark. And as the 24-hour clock began to tick, Eris Thorne realized that humanity's greatest secret wasn't the fleet. It was the fact that they were terrified of what they were becoming in order to win. Marshal Vane sat in his chair on the Iron Weaver, watching the countdown. 23 hours, 59 minutes. 1 hour until the first 10. He didn't close his eyes. He didn't look at the photograph. He just watched the numbers fall. A cold, hard man waiting for the world to end so he could finally start the fight he had been preparing for his entire life. The slang among the crew had changed. No one talked about scrapping quads or ghosting. They talked about the bill. The bill was coming due. And everyone knew that by the time it was paid, there wouldn't be much left of the people who had signed it. The chronometer on the primary bridge of the Iron Weaver did not tick, but to Grand Marshal Silas Vane, every silent pulse of the digital display felt like a hammer blow against his ribs. It had been 23 hours and 54 minutes since Exarch Vorjul had issued his ultimatum. In 6 minutes, the first 10 names on the manifest of the Morning Star would be struck through with a red line. In 6 minutes, the silent pact that had held humanity together for 60 years would claim its first deliberate victims. The bridge was a tomb. The only sounds were the low, predatory hum of the life support and the occasional, nervous click of a technician's keyboard. Silas stood at the center of the pit, his hands gripped so tightly behind his back that his shoulders ached. He was staring at the tactical holomap of the Ethelgard Passage. The Thal'Khar Third Armada was a golden swarm of 4,000 ships, arrayed in a perfect, arrogant blockade. Behind them, The gilded Talon held the Morning Star in a tractor lock like a trophy. "Marshal," the comms officer whispered, her voice cracking under the strain. "We have a live feed from the gilded Talon. They've patched it through to every human colony. They want us to watch." Silas didn't look at the secondary monitor. He knew what was there. He knew the video showed 10 civilians, 6 men and 4 women, standing in a pressurized airlock, their hands zip-tied, their faces pale under the flickering emergency lights. Among them was the father of the boy who had owned the toy ship. Silas didn't need to see the man's face to know he was looking for a rescue that wasn't coming. "Tell the fleet to hold their positions," Silas commanded. His voice was a rasp, a dry rattle of a man who had forgotten the taste of water. "Sir, the Revenant is signaling again," the tactical officer said, his eyes wild. "Captain Vance says he's going in. He says he doesn't give a damn about the secret anymore. He's powering up his phase cannons." "Patch me through to the Revenant," Silas barked. "Now!" The screen flickered, revealing the face of Captain Vance. He was younger than Silas, a man born in the shadow of Project Eventide, his face smeared with the grease of 1,000 combat drills. He looked like he was ready to cry, or to kill. "Captain, you will stand down," Silas said, and the words felt like he was swallowing glass. "Marshal, with all due respect, I can't just sit here and watch them space those people," Vance shouted. "We have the tech. We have the drop on them. We can zero that gilded Talon in 3 seconds flat. And then the Thal'Khar fleet jumps us before our second wave can clear the nebula," Silas countered. "The calibration on the Persistence is still at 78%. If they jump now, their drives will shear their hulls into confetti. You go in there, Vance, and you're trade-offing 4 billion lives for 200. That's not a soldier's math. That's a fool's errand. It's not math, Marshal. It's murder." Vance's voice broke. "If we let them do this, what the hell are we even protecting? If we become the kind of people who watch their own get slaughtered just so our fancy new toys stay hidden, then we're no better than the quads." The bridge went silent. The word quads, a derogatory slang for the 4-armed Thal'Khar, usually brought a smirk of camaraderie among the crew. Today, it felt like a heavy, cold weight. "Stow the chatter, Captain," Silas said, but his voice lacked its usual iron. "You have your orders. If you fire a single shot before I give the word, I will have the Ironweaver's main battery turn you into stardust myself. Am I clear?" Vance stared at Silas for a long, agonizing moment. Then, with a look of pure, unadulterated loathing, he slammed his hand against the console and cut the feed. 1 minute to the hour, the sensor tech announced. Silas looked at the countdown. He thought about Eris Thorne. He knew she was on the floor of the spire, likely being laughed at by 47 different species. She was the shield of words, and he was the sword of fire. And both of them were being broken by the very thing they had spent their lives building. He realized then that the Silent Pact had a flaw. It assumed that the future was something you could build by sacrificing the present. But if you sacrifice enough of the present, if you let enough of your humanity burn away in the name of security, eventually there is nothing left to save. You don't protect the future by becoming a monster. You just ensure that when the future arrives, it is inhabited by ghosts. "Marshal, the gilded Talon is cycling the airlock," the officer said, her voice a sob. Silas looked at the holomap. He saw the 15,000 ships of Project Eventide, the greatest achievement in the history of his kind. They were perfect. They were powerful. They were the guarantee. And they were useless if they couldn't save 10 people in an airlock. "Break the silence," Silas said. The bridge froze. The tactical officer turned, his mouth hanging open. "Sir?" I said. "Break the silence," Silas roared, the sound of it echoing through the metal halls like a thunderclap. Signal the fleet. All waves. All divisions. All wings. Prometheus protocol is active. We're jumping now. But Marshal, the calibration. The chief engineer's voice came over the comms, panicked. We'll lose 3,000 ships in the fold. The math says, to hell with the math, Silas screamed. We're not losing those people. We're not being the ones who watch ever again. Jump the fleet. Tell them to go hot. Tell them to aim for the heart. Across 15 secret shipyards, the order rippled like a lightning strike. In the dark moons of Obsidian 4, in the radiation-choked clouds of the Velonis fringe, in the hollowed-out asteroids of the Kepler belt, 15,000 hearts of fire began to beat as one. The Iron Weaver groaned as its kinetic transposition drive tore a hole in the fabric of space. It wasn't the smooth, elegant transition of a Thal'Khar warp. It was a violent, screaming rip. The ship shuddered, the deck plates vibrating with a frequency that threatened to pull the atoms of the crew apart. "Marshal, we're shearing!" the deck chief shouted. "Hull integrity at 85%. We're taking damage just from the jump." "Hold it together," Silas commanded, gripping the armrests of his chair so hard the leather split. "We're going to Ethelgard." On the Gilded Talon, Captain Krell looked at the timer. 10 seconds. He raised his hand to signal the executioner. He was looking forward to the sound the air would make as it rushed out into the void. 5, 4, 3. The space around the Gilded Talon didn't just ripple, it shattered. The Iron Weaver came out of the jump 3 kilometers from the Thal'Khar flagship. It didn't glide, it collided with reality. The shockwave of its arrival sent the Gilded Talon reeling, its tractor lock on the Morning Star snapping like a piece of twine. "What in the name of the first star?" Krell screamed, staring at his viewport. The view was no longer empty. The Iron Weaver sat there, a 4-kilometer slab of jagged, dark metal, its ghost plating falling away like scales to reveal a hull bristling with more railguns than a Thal'Khar dreadnought. And it wasn't alone. To the left, the Persistence emerged, trailing a cloud of debris from its uncalibrated drive, but its weapons already glowing with a lethal blue light. To the right, the Revenant decloaked, its phase cannons aimed squarely at the Gilded Talon's bridge. And then they kept coming. 500 ships, 1,000, 3,000, 5,000. The Ethelgard Passage, which had been the private playground of the Thal'Khar Third Armada, was suddenly crowded with the ghosts of 60 years of human grief. 15,000 ships filled the sensor displays, a wall of iron that stretched from one edge of the corridor to the other. "Captain Vance," Silas said, his voice now a cold, calm whisper through the comms. "You have the lead. Scratch that golden needle." The Revenant didn't hesitate. Its phase cannons fired, a beam of concentrated energy that didn't hit the Gilded Talon's shields so much as ignore them. The beam passed through the protective layers and struck the ship's primary reactor. The Gilded Talon didn't explode. It evaporated. One moment it was a symbol of imperial pride. The next, it was a cloud of expanding gold dust. The Morning Star was safe. The airlock remained closed. The 10 civilians were still alive. "Marshal, the Thal'Khar Third Armada is scrambling," the tactical officer shouted, his voice full of a wild, hysterical joy. "They're trying to form up, but they're boxed in. They can't move." Silas Vane looked at the screen. He saw the 4,000 Thal'Khar ships, once so large and imposing, now looking like toy boats in a hurricane. He felt the weight of the 60,000 souls of Oros lift, just a fraction. "This is for the Morning Star," Silas whispered. "This is for the silence." He leaned forward, his eyes burning with a light that hadn't been there in decades. All ships, engage at will. Show them why we stayed in the dark. The Battle of Ethelgard had begun, and the humanistic theme, the preservation of the soul over the preservation of the secret, had finally found its voice in the roar of 1,000 cannons. Silas Vane had broken the math, and in doing so, he had finally made humanity worth saving. Exarch Vorjul did not believe his eyes. He sat in his throne of living coral on the bridge of the Imperial Will, staring at the tactical display as if it were a hallucination brought on by a stroke. His 4 arms were frozen, his 3 eyes dilated to the point where the golden light of the bridge was a blinding smear. "Where did they come from?" he whispered, and for the first time in his long, blood-soaked career, his voice was thin. "Where did they come from?" "Sir, I don't know," his censor chief shouted, his voice high with panic. "They just materialized. 15,000 contacts, all of them heavy combat class. Their energy signatures they're off the charts. We're reading power outputs that shouldn't be possible for ships of that mass." Vorjul looked at the Iron Weaver. It was closing the distance with a speed that defied every law of Thal'Khar physics. It was a mountain of metal that moved like a strike craft. "Order the 1st and 2nd battle groups to intercept," Vorjul screamed, the bioluminescent coral of his throne turning a frantic, jagged red. "Surround them. Use the pincer maneuver. They are primitives. They don't know how to fight a fleet action." The Thal'Khar crews were professionals. They had been trained for this since they could walk. They tried to execute the pincer. They turned their golden ships, their engines flaring with the power of 1,000 suns, seeking to wrap around the human vanguard. But the humans didn't follow the rules. The Iron Weaver didn't turn to meet the interceptors. It just kept coming. It rammed through the center of the Thal'Khar line, its kinetic transposition shields absorbing the impact of 3 heavy cruisers as if they were nothing more than insects hitting a windshield. The cruisers didn't just bounce off, they shattered, their hulls buckling under the sheer, overbuilt mass of the human dreadnought. "They aren't avoiding us," Commander Zalth said, his voice flat with horror as he watched the carnage from the back of the bridge. "They're hunting us." On the Iron Weaver, Silas Vane was no longer the tired old man who had sat in the dark of his quarters. He was the conductor of a symphony of destruction. "2nd Division, sweep the port flank," Silas commanded. "Use the phase canisters. I want their shield generators offline before they can even cycle." In the void, thousands of human frigates, ships that had been built by men like Chief Miller and specialists like Kalen Reed, darted through the Thal'Khar formations. They moved with a grinding, mechanical aggression, their pilots using the kinetic transposition drives to make micro-jumps that landed them directly behind the Imperial ships. The Thal'Khar point defense systems were designed to track elegant, predictable evasion patterns. They were not designed to hit a ship that disappeared and reappeared 200 meters away every 5 seconds. It was a slaughter. A Thal'Khar cruiser, a vessel that had survived a dozen wars and conquered 3 worlds, would find itself suddenly flanked by 6 human ghost ships. Before its gunners could even rotate their turrets, a volley of railgun slugs, traveling at 6% the speed of light, would punch through its shields and exit the other side of its hull, leaving behind a trail of fire and dead air. "Marshal, the Thal'Khar 3rd Armada is losing cohesion," the tactical officer shouted. "Their command and control is in shambles. They're trying to retreat to the outer rim." "Don't let them," Silas said. His voice was cold, but it wasn't the cold of the secret anymore. It was the cold of a promise kept. "Close the net." I want every one of their jump gates suppressed. We're not letting them run back to their emperor to tell him they were surprised. We're letting them tell him they were beaten. The battle raged for 3 hours. To an outside observer, it would have looked like a golden tide being slowly, methodically devoured by a dark, jagged reef. The Thal'Khar fired their lasers and their plasma cannons, and they hit. They hit the human ships with enough fire to melt a planet. But the human ships wouldn't die. The overbuilding that Silas Vane had insisted upon 60 years ago was now the difference between life and death. A human destroyer would take a direct hit from a Thal'Khar main battery, and instead of exploding, its redundant shield generators would flare, its triple-layered hull would absorb the heat, and it would keep firing. It was wasteful. It was irrational. It was human. On the Imperial will, the bioluminescent coral was no longer red. It was a dull, dying gray. The bridge was full of smoke and the smell of ozone. Vorzul sat in his throne, watching as his pride, his legacy, was turned into scrap metal. He saw the persistence coming for him. The sister ship to the Iron Weaver had taken a heavy beating during the jump, its hull scorched and its secondary engines trailing a plume of plasma. But its main battery was still glowing. "Exarch, the human flagship is hailing us," Zalth said. He was bleeding from a wound on his head, his 4 arms hanging limp at his sides. Vorzul didn't answer. He just stared at the screen. "Put it through," Zalth commanded. The face of Silas Vane appeared on the Thal'Khar bridge. He wasn't gloating. He didn't look triumphant. He looked like a man who had just finished a very long, very difficult job. "Exarch Vorzul," Silas said. His voice echoed through the dying Thal'Khar ship. "My name is Silas Vane. I am a survivor of Oros." Vorzul's eyes flickered. "Oros? That was nothing." "A skirmish." "To you it was a skirmish," Silas said. "To us, it was the day we realized that the only people who were ever going to save us were ourselves. You thought we were small because we were quiet. You thought we were weak because we followed your rules. You were wrong. We have 4,000 ships." Vorzul screamed, a final desperate burst of arrogance. "We are the hegemony." "You had 4,000 ships," Silas corrected. "Now you have 1,000 wrecks and 3,000 ships trying to find a way out of a room that has no doors." He leaned in, his face hardening. "Tell your emperor that the Ethelgard passage is ours. Tell him that every corridor, every moon, and every star that has a human heart beating near it is now protected by a wall he cannot climb. And tell him that if he ever touches one of our own again, we won't stop at the passage. We'll come to Thal Prime, and we'll show him exactly how much math we've been doing for 60 years. Silas cut the connection. The Iron Weaver and the Persistence fired simultaneously. The kinetic transposition slugs struck the Imperial Will's shield generators, overloading them in a cascade of blue sparks. The next volley took out the engines. The flagship of the Thal'Khar Third Armada went dark. It drifted in the void, a powerless golden tomb. "Marshal, they're surrendering," the tactical officer said, and the silence that followed was the first true silence the Iron Weaver had known since the jump. "All remaining Thal'Khar vessels are powering down. The battle is over." Silas Vane stood up from his chair. He looked at the viewport. He saw the morning star, still drifting but intact. He saw the 15,000 ships of his fleet, some damaged, some broken, but all of them standing tall. He felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Chief Miller. The engineer's face was covered in soot, and his arm was in a makeshift sling. "We did it, Silas," Miller whispered. "We actually did it." Silas looked at the engineer. He thought about Kalen Reed. He thought about the 10 people in the airlock. "We did," Silas said. "But at what cost, Elias? We jumped early. We lost 3,000 ships before the first shot was fired. 3,000 hulls sheared. How many men did we lose in the fold?" Miller looked away. "The latest estimate is 12,000, Marshal. KIA before they even saw the enemy." Silas closed his eyes. 12,000 more names for the wall. 12,000 more reasons to hate the silence. But then he looked at the morning star again. He saw the small, flickering lights of the civilian ship's internal power coming back on. He saw the airlock door open, not to the void, but to a human rescue shuttle. He realized then that the victory wasn't in the 3,000 Thal'Khar ships they had destroyed. It was in the fact that they hadn't waited. For the first time in 60 years, humanity hadn't prioritized the secret over the person. They hadn't let the math dictate their souls. They had been imperfect. They had been reckless. They had lost 12,000 of their own to save 200. And as Silas Vane walked off the bridge, he knew that for the first time since Oros, he could look at himself in the mirror. They were no longer a species that lived in the dark. They were a species that had finally stepped into the light, even if that light was the fire of a war they hadn't wanted. The transformation had begun. It was painful, it was bloody, and it was far from over. But as the Iron Weaver turned toward home, the ghosts of Oros finally seemed to find their peace. Across the galaxy, at the Zenith Spire, Eris Thorne stood on the floor of the High Chamber. She had just received the news. She looked at the 47 delegations, who were all staring at their own screens in a state of collective, paralyzed shock. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She just reached up and touched the silver pin on her lapel. The rising sun was no longer a quaint symbol. It was a warning. Humanity was here, and they were done being quiet. "Marshal, the Revenant is asking for permission to escort the Morning Star back to the inner belt," the comms officer called out. "Permission granted," Silas said, his voice echoing through the quiet bridge. "Tell Captain Vance to take them all the way to Earth. Let them see the sky." The fleet began its slow, deliberate departure. 15,000 ships, minus the 3,000 they had lost, turned away from the carnage of Ethelgard. They moved with a new kind of confidence, a weight that wasn't just metal and fire. They were the shield, and they had finally learned that a shield is only as strong as the heart that holds it. The secret was dead. But for Silas Vane and Eris Thorne, for the first time in 60 years, humanity was finally, truly alive. The silence that followed the Battle of Ethelgard was not the peaceful quiet of a summer evening, but the heavy, suffocating stillness of a graveyard. In the wake of the kinetic transposition slugs and the searing phase beams, the corridor was no longer a glittering lane of trade. It was a jagged field of pulverized gold and scorched tungsten, a wasteland where the pride of an empire had been ground into stardust by the desperation of a ghost. On the bridge of the Iron Weaver, the air smelled of ozone and the coppery tang of blood. Grand Marshal Silas Vane sat in his command chair, his eyes fixed on the primary tactical display. The 4,000 ships of the Thal'Khar Third Armada had been reduced to less than 900 functional hulls, most of which were now venting atmosphere and broadcasting frantic surrender codes on every frequency. The rest were drifting hulks, their golden armor peeled back like the skin of a fruit to reveal the blackened machinery beneath. "We have the Count, Marshal," Chief Miller whispered. The old engineer looked like he had been dragged through a rock crusher. His uniform was torn, and his hands were stained with the hydraulic fluid of a dozen emergency repairs. Silas didn't turn his head. "Give it to me straight, Elias. Don't sugarcoat the bill." Miller swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "We saved the 212 colonists on the Morning Star. Every last one of them. The rescue shuttles have them all accounted for." He paused, the weight of the next sentence clearly pressing down on his chest. "But the jump. The uncalibrated jump cost us 3,014 ships. They sheared in the fold, Marshal. Most of them didn't even realize they were dying. They were just deleted from reality." "How many?" Silas asked, his voice a low, hollow rasp. 12,486 KIA, Miller said. "And that's not counting the 4,000 wounded in the actual engagement." 12,000, Silas repeated. The number felt like a physical weight, a mountain of granite settling onto his shoulders. He had spent 60 years trying to prevent another Oros, trying to make sure that humanity never had to pay a blood tax again. And in one afternoon, he had written a check for 12,000 lives to save 200. "The math is a bitch, isn't it?" a voice said from the comms pit. Silas looked over to see Captain Vance standing there. The young officer's face was a mask of soot and dried blood. His ship, the Revenant, was currently docked with the Iron Weaver for emergency cooling, its hull glowing a dull, angry red from the heat of its phase cannons. "You did the right thing, Marshal," Vance said, his voice shaking with a mixture of exhaustion and adrenaline. "I know the top brass back home are going to have a field day with the casualty reports. They're going to call you a cowboy. They're going to say you threw away 3,000 hulls for a handful of dirt and a few civilians." "And what do you say, Captain?" Silas asked. Vance looked at the monitor showing the rescue operation. "I say those 12,000 didn't die because the peacekeepers were late. They died because they chose to be the ones who showed up. They died being the shield, not the victim. That makes all the difference in the world. My grandfather wouldn't have cared about the math on Oros. He just would have wanted to know someone was coming for him." Silas looked at the young man and saw a reflection of the fire he had once carried. He realized that Vance was right, in a way that the tactical computers could never understand. The Silent Pact had been about survival, but survival without a soul was just a different kind of death. By jumping early, by choosing the people over the secret, they had finally defined what humanity was actually fighting for. Meanwhile, at the Zenith Spire, the immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of political glass shattering. Director Eris Thorne stood in the center of the human delegation box, watching as the delegates of 47 civilizations scrambled to make sense of a universe that had fundamentally changed in the span of 3 hours. The Thal'Khar representatives had been escorted from the floor, their forearms bound in traditional diplomatic restraints. Exarch Vorzul's defeat wasn't just a military loss, it was a civilizational humiliation. The myth of the hegemony's invincibility had been detonated. Director Thorne, the Vesper ambassador, buzzed, his light filaments flickering in a chaotic pattern of orange and blue. We have seen the footage. 15,000 ships? How is such a thing possible? How could you maintain such a deception for 60 years? We didn't deceive you, Ambassador, Eris said, her voice echoing through the stunned chamber. We simply gave you exactly what you expected to see. You expected us to be small, so we stayed small in your eyes. You expected us to be helpless, so we played the part of the junior partner. You built a cage of assumptions around us, and we simply used the shadows of that cage to build our future. Is it a future we should fear? The Harkin Collective asked, their multiple voices merging into a suspicious drone. You have more firepower than the rest of the sovereignty combined. Do you intend to become the new hegemony? Eris looked around the room. She saw the fear, the envy, and the sudden, sharp respect in their eyes. She knew that the next 10 minutes would determine whether the last 60 years had been a preparation for peace or a prelude to a never-ending war. If we wanted to be the hegemony, we would have let the Thal'Khar destroy the Third Armada and then marched on Thal Prime, Aris said. Instead, our Marshal has already issued an order for human medical frigates to assist the Thal'Khar survivors. We aren't here to rule you. We are here to tell you that the era of lesser species is over. She stepped forward, her silver pin glinting under the artificial stars. Humanity is proposing the Mutual Defense Compact. We will share the ghost plating technology. We will share the kinetic transposition drive. But, in exchange, every member of this spire must sign a binding recognition of absolute sovereignty. No more mandates. No more higher stewardship. No more looking the other way when a neighbor's house is on fire. The chamber went silent. It was a proposal of such staggering generosity and such terrifying implications that no one knew how to respond. Back on the Iron Weaver, Silas Vane was walking through the primary hangar deck. He passed rows of wounded soldiers, their groans muffled by the hiss of med-gel dispensers. He saw the technicians working on the jagged remains of the ships that had survived the jump. He stopped when he saw a small figure sitting on a crate near the airlock. It was a little girl, no more than 7 years old, one of the survivors from the Morning Star. She was holding a ragged doll, her eyes wide as she watched the massive machinery of the hangar move around her. "Hey there, kiddo," Silas said, kneeling down despite the protest of his aching knees. "You doing okay?" The girl looked at him, then at the scarred gray uniform he wore. "Are you the one who brought the big ships?" she asked. Silas managed a small, weary smile. "I guess I am." "My daddy said the stars were going to swallow us," she whispered. But then the dark started fighting back. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small metallic object. It was another toy ship, but this one wasn't carved from scrap. It was a crudely folded piece of foil from a ration pack, shaped to look like the Iron Weaver. "For you," she said, pressing it into his hand, "because you didn't stay ghosted." Silas gripped the foil toy, feeling the thin edges bite into his palm. He thought about the 12,000 who had died in the fold. He thought about the 60 years of lies and the cold, hard math of the secret. "It's a heavy lifting, isn't it?" Chief Miller asked, coming up behind him. "Yeah," Silas said, standing up and tucking the foil toy into his jacket pocket. "It's a hell of a bill, Elias, but I think I finally understand the exchange rate. We didn't build 15,000 ships to win a war. We built them so we could finally afford to be human again." He looked out the hangar bay doors at the stars. They didn't look like threats anymore. They looked like a beginning. The official signing of the Zenith Accord took place exactly 120 days after the Battle of Ethelgard. The ceremony was held not in the high, imposing galleries of the spire, but on the surface of Oros. It was a world still scarred by the cinders of the past, but the first green shoots of bioengineered flora were beginning to push through the blackened soil. The atmosphere was breathable now, though it still carried the faint, lingering scent of old smoke. Aris Thorne stood on the wooden platform that had been erected over the very spot where the first colony transport had been destroyed 60 years ago. Behind her, the Iron Weaver and the Persistence hung in the blue sky, their massive hulls casting long, protective shadows over the assembly. Delegates from all 47 species were there, but they weren't sitting in tiered boxes according to their rank. They were standing on the dirt, shoulder to shoulder. To their left stood a formation of the survivors from the Morning Star. To their right stood a silent guard of human soldiers, their uniforms clean, but their faces still carrying the hardness of the secret they had kept for so long. Eris didn't give a long speech. She didn't need to. The presence of the fleet was the only statement that mattered. She simply signed the document that abolished the tiered membership of the sovereignty and established the new era of mutual defense. When she finished, she looked toward the back of the crowd and saw Silas Vane. He wasn't in uniform. He was wearing a simple civilian coat, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked like any other man who had spent a lifetime working in the sun and was finally ready for a rest. He caught her eye and gave a small, barely perceptible nod. Then he turned and began walking away from the ceremony toward the edge of the new forest. Eris followed him. She caught up to him near a small stream that was bubbling with the sound of reclaimed life. "You're not staying for the banquet?" she asked. "The Vesper ambassador has been practicing a song in your honor for 3 weeks. I think it involves a lot of high-frequency humming." Silas chuckled, the sound more natural than it had been in decades. "I think I've had enough humming to last me 3 lifetimes, Eris. My ears are still ringing from the reactor core on the Weaver." He stopped and looked at a small tree that was swaying in the breeze. "I'm retiring," he said, "effective yesterday. I've already handed the keys to the fleet to Captain Vance. He's a good kid. He's got the fire, but he knows when to use a dampener." "You're leaving the guarantee in the hands of a 30-year-old? "I'm leaving it in the hands of a generation that doesn't have to grow up in the dark," Silas corrected. "That was always the goal, wasn't it? To make ourselves obsolete." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small foil toy the little girl had given him. He looked at it for a long moment, then set it gently on a flat rock by the stream. "I spent 60 years doing the math, Eris," Silas said, his voice dropping into a quiet reflection. "I spent every waking hour calculating how many credits it cost to build a railgun, how many light years we could jump before a hull failed, and how many lives we could afford to lose to keep a secret. I thought that was what it meant to lead. I thought power was about the things you could hide until the moment you needed to break someone with them." He looked at his hands, scarred and calloused by a lifetime of service. "But standing on that bridge, watching those 10 people in the airlock, I realized that the math was a cage. We had built the biggest, most expensive cage in the galaxy. We were so busy being lesser in public and monsters in private that we forgot how to just be people." He turned to Eris, his eyes clear and peaceful. "The moment I told the fleet to jump early, I knew I was destroying my career. I knew I was breaking the secrecy we had bled for. And it was the first time in 60 years I felt like I was actually breathing. We didn't save those people because we had 15,000 ships. We saved them because we finally remembered that one life is worth more than 100 years of perfect planning. That's the real secret, Eris. Not the ghost plating. Not the phase cannons. It's the fact that we're the only ones crazy enough to throw it all away for a stranger." Eris watched him, her heart heavy with the beauty of the moment. She realized that Silas had undergone a transformation that was far more significant than the shift in galactic politics. He had moved from a man who protected the future to a man who was finally allowed to live in it. "I'm going to miss you, Silas," she said. "No, you won't," he said, turning to continue his walk into the forest. "You'll be too busy keeping the peacekeepers from arguing about the dessert menu. Besides, I'm not going far. I've got a small plot of land about 10 kilometers from here. I'm going to see if I can grow something that doesn't require a fusion reactor to keep it alive." He waved a hand over his shoulder, a casual, easy gesture. Eris stood by the stream for a long time, watching him disappear into the green. She looked at the foil toy on the rock, then up at the massive ships in the sky. For 60 years, they had been the center of her universe. Now, they were just tools. Important tools, but tools nonetheless. She thought about the journey they had all taken, the soot of Oros, the cold of Obsidian 4, the blood of Ethelgard. She thought about the millions of humans who had contributed to the Silent Pact, most of whom would never see their names in a history book. They had done something impossible. They had built a mountain in the dark, and then they had used it as a stepping stone to reach the light. They had learned that power isn't about what you can take, but about what you are willing to risk to keep your heart from turning to stone. As she turned to walk back to the ceremony, Eris felt the warmth of the sun on her face. It was a real sun, a real world, and for the first time in her life, it was a real peace. I spent my entire adult life believing that the world was a series of trade-offs, a grand balance sheet where the survival of the many always justified the silence of the few. I thought that by building 15,000 walls around our heart, we were making ourselves safe. But standing on the bridge of the Iron Weaver, I saw the faces of those 10 people in the airlock, and I realized that a wall doesn't just keep the enemy out, it keeps the light from getting in. We had become so good at hiding that we had almost hidden ourselves from the very things that make us human: compassion, recklessness, and the stubborn refusal to let a neighbor suffer alone. I realized that the ultimate measure of a civilization isn't the size of its fleet or the complexity of its secrets, but its willingness to break its own heart to do what is right. We spent 60 years preparing for a war, but in the end, our greatest victory was choosing to end the silence. I am no longer a Grand Marshal of a ghost fleet. I am just a man who is finally learning that you don't protect the future by hoarding it. You protect it by giving it away, piece by piece, to anyone who needs a hand in the dark. I wonder if you were holding a secret that could save your world, but revealed it would cost you everything you had worked for to save just one person you had never met. Would you have the courage to break the math? Silas Vane knelt by the edge of the stream and picked up a handful of the rich, dark soil of Oros. He let it slip through his fingers, a slow and deliberate release, watching as the dust joined the water and began its long journey toward the sea. The sun climbed higher, casting the shadows of the great ships far behind him, leaving nothing but the green and the light.